It all began in the silent corridors of the Chrono Research Facility, a place where time was not a mystery, but a measurable force, something we could twist, bend, and study like light through a prism. I had worked there for years, dedicated to understanding the laws that governed the universe. But beneath all the equations and simulations, there was something personal driving me, a mistake buried deep in my past that I could never forget. Every night, no matter how many theories I solved or discoveries I made, that one moment replayed in my mind. It was a wound that time refused to heal, and so I decided to heal it myself. Time travel was not a dream anymore. It was a reality, one locked behind protocols, restrictions, and oaths sworn by every scientist who dared to touch the chronogate. The first rule was clear: never use it for personal reasons. The risks were too great. Paradoxes, fractures in causality, the potential unraveling of existence itself. But when you've lived with regret long enough, fear begins to lose its power. You start to believe that consequences are just distant shadows compared to the pain that lives inside you every day. The night I broke the rule, the lab was empty, the cameras were off, and the air was still. I stood before the chronogate, a massive ring of shifting light, humming softly like a sleeping storm. It wasn't supposed to be active without authorization, but I had designed parts of it myself. I knew how to make it listen to me. My hands trembled as I entered the coordinates. My hometown, 50 years back. The exact day my life changed forever. The console warned me. Unauthorized temporal displacement will result in disciplinary action. But what could they possibly do to me that time hadn't already done? I hesitated, staring into the whirl of light. Every instinct told me to stop, that I was crossing a line humanity wasn't ready to cross. But regret is a louder voice than reason. I thought about the person I could have been if I hadn't made that choice, if I hadn't trusted the wrong person, if I hadn't walked away from everything that mattered. I convinced myself I was doing it for science, to study the emotional implications of temporal interaction, but deep down I knew that was a lie. I was doing it because I couldn't move on. As the machine activated, the room filled with a blinding glow, a pull that felt like being torn through the seams of existence. My breath caught in my throat as gravity, sound, and time itself seemed to collapse around me. And then, silence. The air was colder, thinner. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a world that looked familiar but felt impossibly distant. The skyline was younger, cleaner, untouched by decades of change. I was home, but not the home I knew. Every step I took echoed with disbelief. The streets, the lights, the smell of rain on asphalt, it was all exactly as I remembered. The laws of physics said I shouldn't be here. Yet here I was, walking through a memory that had come alive. I knew I shouldn't interact with anyone, that even the smallest disturbance could ripple through history in unpredictable ways. But my purpose wasn't observation. It was confrontation. I needed to find him, the younger me. The one who still had hope, the one who didn't know what was coming. I tracked down my old address, the small apartment where I used to live before everything fell apart. The lights were on. I could hear music playing, the same song I used to listen to when I was working late into the night. My heart pounded as I approached the door. I didn't have a plan for what I would say. How do you convince your past self that you're real, that you've come from a future shaped by their mistakes? How do you tell them that everything they're about to do will destroy them? I raised my hand to knock, but froze. This was the moment where everything could change or collapse. The rule I had broken wasn't just about technology or ethics. It was about the fragile fabric of identity, about how one decision could split reality in ways we couldn't predict. I thought I was strong enough to handle it, but standing there, staring at that door, I realized how unprepared I truly was. I had crossed a boundary meant to protect not just the world, but me. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can face isn't the future, it's your own past. Inside that apartment was the version of me who still believed in second chances, who thought knowledge could fix everything. I envied him, and I hated him for it. My entire body shook with the weight of what I was about to do. The machine back in the future couldn't prepare me for this. The raw emotion of being on the edge, of rewriting my own life. I wasn't just breaking the rule of time travel. I was breaking the natural rhythm of human experience. The rule existed because no one should have the power to undo who they are. But regret is a kind of gravity. Once it pulls you hard enough, you stop caring about what's right or wrong. You only see the possibility of erasing the pain. I convinced myself that I wasn't changing time. I was healing it. That if I could just warn him, stop him from making that one choice, everything would finally make sense again. But beneath that hope was fear. Fear that maybe I wasn't meant to change it. That maybe the pain was supposed to happen. Still, I couldn't stop. I pressed my hand against the door, my pulse racing faster than my thoughts. I told myself that this was science, that I was in control, that history was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about control anymore. It was about desperation, about a man who had everything: intelligence, technology, power, and still couldn't escape his own guilt. And so, I knocked. The door opened slowly, and there he was, me, 25 years younger, staring back with wide, uncertain eyes. His face was thinner, his hair darker, his expression full of life and questions. For a moment, we just stood there, trapped between disbelief and recognition. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. I had imagined this meeting countless times, rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain, how I would convince him that I wasn't an intruder or a ghost. But in that moment, all words escaped me. There's something unnatural about looking into your own eyes and seeing a version of yourself, untouched by pain, unaware of everything that's coming. It's like meeting a reflection that refuses to move the way you do. He frowned, studying me with suspicion, confusion, maybe even fear. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice exactly as I remembered it, confident yet uncertain in the quietest ways. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound insane? I forced a smile, an instinctive gesture to ease his nerves. though it only seemed to make him more wary. He glanced at my clothes, my face, the way I carried myself. I could see his mind racing, analyzing me, trying to find a logical explanation for this stranger who looked just like him. Finally, I said the words I'd been carrying like a secret for years. I'm you. The silence that followed felt like gravity collapsing inward. He laughed at first, a short, nervous laugh. Right, he said, stepping back a little. And I'm Einstein. I didn't blame him. If I were in his place, I wouldn't have believed it either. I tried to reach for proof, something undeniable. I mentioned his upcoming project, the one he hadn't told anyone about yet. I described the fight he had with his best friend last week, the scar on his right wrist that only appeared because of an accident he'd never told anyone about. Each word I spoke deepened the look of disbelief on his face. He wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing, trying to find the trick. "How do you know all that?" he asked quietly. I could hear the crack in his voice, the moment logic began to crumble. I told him again, because I lived it. I am you. He shook his head violently, stepping back as if to distance himself from the truth. "That's not possible," he said, pacing across the room. "This is some kind of test, or prank, or something." He couldn't accept it. His mind, so grounded in science and reason, refused to let imagination rewrite the laws of nature. Watching him reject me felt like reliving all the stubbornness I once had. I had always prided myself on logic, on needing evidence before belief. Now I stood in front of that same mind, realizing just how impossible it was to convince. I thought time travel would be the hardest part of this journey, but I was wrong. The hardest part was making myself believe that the truth could exist without proof. He demanded answers I couldn't give without breaking the world further apart. Every attempt I made to explain only made him retreat further into disbelief. He began to study me like a scientist faced with an anomaly. He asked for ID, for documents, for something to prove that I wasn't just a look-alike. I told him about the chronogate, the machine we would build together decades later. He stared at me as if hearing the words of a madman. "Time travel is theoretical," he said firmly. "We're years away from any real progress." I could almost smile at that. He had no idea how close he already was. I saw the same fire in his eyes that once drove me to defy the rules of nature. That same ambition, that same arrogance that believed nothing was impossible. For a moment, I thought maybe he was beginning to believe. His eyes softened, his breathing steadied. But then he said something that cut deeper than I expected. "If you're really me, then tell me why you're here. What do you want from me?" The question carried a weight I wasn't ready for. I looked at him and saw the version of myself that still had dreams, who hadn't yet learned the cost of ambition. I told him I was there to warn him, to stop him from making a mistake that would destroy everything he cared about. But instead of gratitude, I saw suspicion flicker in his eyes. "Warn me about what?" he demanded. I hesitated. How could I explain without unraveling the timeline? How could I describe a pain he hadn't yet earned? I tried to choose my words carefully, but the more I spoke, the more he withdrew. He thought I was trying to manipulate him. "You're not me," he said finally, shaking his head. "You're just someone who knows too much." I could see it in his eyes. His disbelief wasn't just about science anymore. It was emotional. He couldn't face the idea that his future self was standing there, broken, haunted, trying to undo what he hadn't even done yet. I realized then that disbelief is a kind of defense mechanism. He didn't want to believe me, not because it was impossible, but because it was too painful to accept what it implied. To believe me meant admitting that somewhere along the way he would fail, that he would become the very man standing before him. Tired, scarred, and desperate, he wasn't ready to see that reflection. And maybe I wasn't ready to be seen. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now, but filled with something like pity. "If you really are me," he said, "then you know I won't listen." He was right. I did know. Because I remembered this moment, not from this side, but from his. I remembered the confusion, the fear, the refusal to accept. I remembered the stranger who appeared one night and claimed to be me, and how I had laughed, how I had pushed him away, how I told myself it couldn't be real. It hit me then. The paradox had already happened. I wasn't changing history. I was fulfilling it. I had become the very man who came back all those years ago, repeating the same cycle, saying the same words, facing the same disbelief. My journey to change the past had already been written into it, sealed by my own refusal to believe once upon a time. The look in his eyes, the disbelief, the anger, it was all part of the loop. And in that moment, I finally understood that I wasn't here to save him. I was here to relive the moment that had defined us both. After that confrontation, I walked away from my younger self with a silence heavier than any truth I could have spoken. The city around me was alive, vibrant, full of the sounds of a world that hadn't yet collapsed under the weight of what was to come. Every street, every corner held echoes of memories I had tried to erase. Standing there, surrounded by the past I had once called home, I began to realize something I had never truly faced. That pain wasn't something to be undone. It was something to be understood. The very ache that had driven me to break the laws of time was the same force that had built the person I had become. Without it, I wouldn't have been standing there at all. When you live long enough, pain stops feeling like a wound and starts becoming part of your structure, like the rings of a tree marking the years it has survived. Every mistake, every betrayal, every sleepless night becomes another layer of who you are. I had spent decades trying to outrun mine, pretending that if I could just alter the past, I could erase the version of myself that carried all that regret. But now, watching my younger self disappear behind that apartment door, I finally began to see the truth. If I erased the pain, I would erase the person forged by it. The future me would vanish, not because time had been rewritten, but because the foundation of my existence would no longer have meaning. I remembered all the years after that one decision, the isolation, the loss, the endless drive to make sense of a universe that seemed indifferent to human suffering. Every failure had pushed me closer to discovery, not because I wanted glory, but because I needed redemption. That drive, born from pain, was what led me to create the chronogate in the first place. Without it, there would have been no invention, no understanding of time, no reason to question existence itself. I had wanted to destroy the source of my suffering, but that suffering had been the spark that lit everything. Pain wasn't just a scar. It was the blueprint of every decision, every moment of courage, every insight that had shaped my life. I walked through the familiar streets, past the cafe where I used to sit for hours, sketching equations on napkins, past the bridge where I once made promises I couldn't keep. Every detail hit me with a strange clarity. I was seeing my life not as a sequence of mistakes, but as a story written in the language of endurance. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how blind I had been to the role of pain in shaping identity. We spend our lives trying to avoid it, to shield ourselves from it, to rewrite it. But without it, we lose the contrast that defines who we are. A life without pain would be a flat line, a story without tension, a melody without dissonance. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had endured. Not as a curse, but as proof that I had lived. The sleepless nights after failure, the hollow silence of loss, the regret that gnawed at me through the years, all of it had carved depth into me. It had given my choices meaning. I had been so obsessed with perfection, with undoing the flaws of my past, that I had forgotten that growth only comes from breaking. The fractures are where the light gets in. The same pain I hated was the teacher that had shown me compassion, resilience, and humility. Without it, I would have been nothing but a hollow version of the man I thought I wanted to be. I thought about my younger self again, the disbelief in his eyes, the anger, the fear. At first I had seen it as defiance, but now I recognized it as innocence. He didn't understand pain yet, not the kind that changes you at your core. He was still living in a world where success and failure were simple opposites, where right and wrong were clear. I envied that clarity, but I also pitied it, because sooner or later he would learn the truth, that pain doesn't destroy identity, it forges it. Every loss he would experience, every failure that would crush him, every regret that would haunt him, those would be the very things that built his strength. The man he would become wasn't created in moments of triumph, but in moments of despair. I had traveled through time thinking I could edit my story, but time wasn't the enemy. It was the witness. It held every moment of struggle and transformation, every lesson written in pain. I began to see how human identity itself is intertwined with suffering. We define ourselves by how we endure, by how we rise after falling. Pain gives context to joy, depth to purpose, and meaning to existence. The universe itself seemed to mirror that truth. The stars born from violent explosions, the earth shaped by pressure and fire, the human heart strengthened by breaking and healing again. Everything that lives grows through some form of pain. As I continued walking, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The urge to fix the past began to fade. I didn't feel healed, But I felt awake. I could see now that I hadn't traveled back to change my story, but to understand it. All those years I had cursed myself for one mistake, when in truth, that mistake had been the beginning of everything. Without it, I would never have learned compassion, never have sought meaning, never have questioned the limits of time and existence. Pain had been my greatest teacher, even when I refused to listen. It had shaped every version of me that ever existed. Past, present, and future, standing under the same sky I once dreamed beneath, I could almost feel time folding around me. Not as an enemy, but as a companion. Every decision I made, every consequence I faced, every heartbreak I endured, they all connected in one unbroken line of cause and effect. I had wanted to change a single thread, not realizing that to pull one was to unravel the entire fabric. Pain wasn't a flaw in that design. It was the pattern itself, woven into the identity of who I was and who I would always be. When I returned to the future, the lab was silent. The chronogate stood exactly as I had left it, humming faintly in the dark, its light dimming like the last pulse of a dying star. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the machine that had carried me through time and back, realizing that nothing around me had changed except me. The world still existed, the facility still gleamed with sterile perfection. The air still carried the faint buzz of electricity. But inside me, something had shifted, something irreversible. I understood now what I never could before, that the past isn't meant to be rewritten, only understood. And more importantly, that forgiveness is the only form of time travel that truly works. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had built the impossible, and yet couldn't hold on to peace. For years, I had blamed them for creating, for destroying, for reaching too far. I thought the only way to make things right was to change the moment that started my suffering. But standing in the aftermath of my own defiance, I finally saw it clearly. I didn't need to change what I had done. I needed to forgive the person who did it. I needed to forgive myself, the younger me who didn't know better, who acted out of hope, who made mistakes because he still believed he could fix everything. It's strange how forgiveness feels harder than time travel. Machines can bend reality, equations can predict motion, but the human heart is stubborn. It clings to pain as proof of existence. I had spent decades carrying the weight of guilt, feeding it with every failure and disappointment, believing that self-punishment was the only way to stay accountable. But what it really did was trap me. I became a prisoner of my own regret, unable to move forward because I was always looking back. Time travel hadn't been my salvation. It had been my symptom. It was proof that I couldn't let go. I walked across the lab, each step echoing softly against the metal floor. Everything looked exactly as before, yet every detail carried new meaning. The control panels, the journals, the equations scribbled on the walls. They were all fragments of a man who thought knowledge could replace forgiveness. For the first time, I saw them for what they were, a monument to guilt. All the brilliance, all the discovery, all the science, it had been my way of apologizing to a universe that never asked for an apology. I thought about my younger self again. The look in his eyes, the disbelief, the anger. I had wanted him to listen, to change, to make different choices. But now I realized he wasn't supposed to. His disbelief wasn't arrogance, it was protection. He needed to make those choices, to face those consequences, to walk that same path of mistakes, because without that journey, neither of us would exist. I had gone back trying to save him, but it was he who had saved me. Seeing him reminded me that the person I used to be wasn't the villain I had painted in my memories. He was just human, flawed, hopeful, afraid. Forgiving him meant accepting every version of myself that existed along the way. The scientist, the dreamer, the fool, the broken man. Forgiving him meant letting go of the idea that life was supposed to be perfect. That moment of understanding was like stepping outside of time altogether. I could see it now, the entire arc of my life, not as a line of failures, but as a series of necessary transformations. Each regret was a step, each pain a lesson, each mistake a catalyst. I didn't need to undo the past to find peace. I needed to make peace with the past I already had. The chronogate flickered faintly, as if it too understood its purpose had changed. I approached it slowly, running my hand along the rim of its metallic surface. I had thought of it as a weapon against time, but now it felt more like a mirror. All it had ever shown me was myself, my fears, my grief, my obsession with control. I realized then that maybe the true danger of time travel wasn't the paradoxes or the disruption of cause and effect. Maybe it was the temptation to escape accountability, to believe we could fix what only acceptance could heal. The future outside the lab stretched endlessly, but I didn't rush toward it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to outrun my memories. I sat at my desk, opened an old journal, and began to write. Not equations this time, but reflections. Words that weren't about time or science, but about forgiveness. I wrote to the version of myself I had met. I told him it was okay to fail, okay to break, okay to not know what the future held. I told him that someday he would make peace with himself, that every mistake he feared would one day become his greatest teacher. As I wrote, I felt something uncoil inside me, a quiet release I had never known before. The guilt that had once felt like gravity began to lift. I realized that the past wasn't an enemy to conquer. It was a teacher I had finally learned to listen to. Forgiveness didn't erase what happened. It simply changed the way I carried it. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined me. It had transformed into understanding, into wisdom, into something almost like gratitude. Outside the window, the first light of morning crept across the horizon. It was a new day, indistinguishable from any other, yet entirely different because I was no longer the same man watching it rise. The world hadn't changed, but my perception of it had. I had always believed that redemption would come from rewriting history, but now I knew that redemption begins the moment you stop fighting yourself. I thought time was linear, an unstoppable force moving forward, but I understood now that forgiveness bends time in its own quiet way. It doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. In that stillness, I realized I didn't need to travel through time again. The machine had served its purpose, not by changing history, but by showing me what was always waiting within it. Every version of me, past, present, and future, was connected by one simple truth. We are all trying to forgive ourselves for the things we didn't know then, for the choices we made when we were still learning how to be human.